My name is Ashley Johnson, and I'm the Chief Financial and Operating Officer at Planet. Today, I'm in the studio, and I have the distinct pleasure of chatting with Dr. Sara Boettiger, the Senior Vice President and Head of Public Affairs, Science, and Sustainability for the Crop Science Division of Bayer. Prior to joining Bayer, Sara co-led the McKinsey Center for Agriculture Transformation. She also served as Deputy Director at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of the International Agriculture and Research Institute at CIMMYT, Senior Advisor at Syngenta Foundation, Faculty Fellow at Harvard University's Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society. She's a co-founder of several nonprofits, adjunct professor at UC Berkeley, and a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Councils. Sara, thank you so much for joining us today at Planet Explore. I have to start by saying that I am really impressed by your background. It spans a number of different fields, in particular law, intellectual property, policy, and technology, to understand and eradicate global poverty. Can you please share a little bit about how you found yourself involved in these fascinating areas?
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me. I think this focus on tackling hunger and poverty was kind of something that was ingrained in me. I grew up in a long line of family that paid attention to the inequities in our community and in our world, and had this kind of expectation that you don't just stand on the sidelines, but you actually get out there and do something. So it was sort of a, how do I manage to fit that in? With the fact that really I am an economist by, through and through, in my heart and in my mind, and economists have these tools of systems and policies and behavior change and institutions, and somewhere along the line I became kind of obsessed with scale. So it's not to say that the impact you have at a personal level or a community level isn't critical, but I just became kind of really focused on how do you use this toolkit to try to solve really big problems in a really big way. And so that brought me to all of the places that I've been. How do you think about finance mechanisms to fund things that aren't happening, or policy frameworks that shift incentives, or of course innovation and technology and this tremendous scaling power of digital. So that's the toolkit I've been playing in. That's been my sandbox for these years. I think, I have to say I've gotten even more impatient with age. I really believe that we're not even running out of time. I think we're out of time to make some of these really big shifts in the agri-food system.
I know at Bayer, the company's really trying to make a lot of investments to make sustainability core to the business and operational strategy of the company, particularly in technology and R&D. From your point of view, is there any one particular area of investment or one particular program that you have found most compelling or impactful?
Yeah, it's true. We're super serious about our approach to sustainability. And before I jump into it's hard to pick one, but before I jump into that, I'll just kind of distinguish. There's corporate commitments that lots of companies make, and we are all over those. We have our carbon neutral in our operations by 2030 and 100% purchase of electricity from renewable sources. And then we have a whole range of other corporate commitments. But beyond that, it's really this piece that you just said, which is how, if you're operating in agriculture and you're serving farmers, these are not just commitments. This is about long-term growth. It's about looking at how the system is going to change and how your company is going to navigate that. So future markets or farmers' risk in what they're planting and how they're dealing with climate change, or what our future policy frameworks are going to look like. So it's really, it's exciting to me because to me, that's how the private sector has real power. Is not when you could sort of park it in the reputational side or the marketing side of a company, but when you draw it into the middle of the strategy. So I'll give you one example, which is there's a real revolution going on in plant breeding. Plant breeding is a historically very slow process. It takes years. You plant, you wait to identify the traits, and you select them. And at the same time, we're really fighting against the clock to try to figure out how to get the right varieties out there for new pest diseases, higher yield to feed this growing population, and how we can help farmers manage in climate change. And what we're doing now is shifting our breeding to AI-driven breeding decisions. So we have the genotype of the plants, we have the phenotype of the plants. We can match the right genetics for certain cropping systems and conditions, and it's just sped up how fast we can do this. So we're better prepared to meet all these challenges as they come. And there's lots of different ways that people are tackling this kind of acceleration of plant breeding. We just announced, I want to say last week, but it was a short while ago, from our Leaps venture arm at Bayer, a super cool company called Sound Ag, which is doing a different approach to accelerating plant breeding, this time by turning on the expression of a plant's natural traits, so turning them up and down. So just really exciting ways of getting the right varieties out faster than we used to be able to.
I think similarly, as we think about scale, and you mentioned this in your opening comments, the way we attack a problem or challenge that is of the scale that we're talking about, like hunger and poverty and global sustainability, you really have to think about how companies and other entities around the world can really come together on solving these problems. Obviously, this is a core theme at our conference, global connection. In that vein, no single entity can solve this alone. So how are you thinking about the role of private-public partnerships in achieving secure, sustainable agriculture and food systems?
Yeah, I think it gets back, exactly as you said, to this question of scale and the urgency with which we need to act. And the public sector is so critical in governments and universities and foundations and development banks, but at the same time, we desperately need these huge R&D engines of the private sector, and we need the agility of startups to really be innovating out on the edge. And we need the private sector's focus to turn that innovation into a product, and to focus on the end user to make sure that we get there fast, and to reach people at scale. So all of those are you can't do it one side, you can't do it the other. If we're really going to do this at scale, I think we need both public and private sectors. I'm a huge fan and advocate of public-private partnerships, but they're difficult. They're hard to stand up. They're hard to manage. And we now have an entire team at Bayer that just for sustainability manages these partnerships, which is, I think, part of the key piece. This isn't part of somebody who's working in a company that just tries to do a public-private partnership on the side. These folks are sort of focused on these partnerships. A good example is actually one we did with Planet. Earlier this year, we supported the World Economic Forum launching this European carbon farming coalition, which I can talk about as a super cool example of both public and private sector playing different roles, trying to figure out who can share data, who can share knowledge, where our lines are for how we join together. Another one is the LEAF coalition, which Bayer just joined this year, which is lowering emission by accelerating forest finance. And that has governments and large companies really trying to move the needle on financing climate action in tropical forest countries. So again, something that's just not going to happen unless you have both of those sides at the table.
It's really interesting how you're bringing these different parties together. You mentioned to me that there are a number of challenges in doing that. Are there things in particular that you can point to, or is there more that you can share around this European Carbon Farming Coalition that distinguishes what has made that successful and what might be some takeaways from that initiative?
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenges are sometimes as simple as sort of culture. That private sector and public sector operate at quite different speeds. They talk somewhat different languages, but it's also sort of defining what you're putting in and where your red lines are. How are you going to be able to share your data, which is proprietary? What parts are companies going to be able to be okay with on? Sometimes we call it pre-competitive, but there's a lot of space in there, and if you start sort of creatively pushing on how companies can contribute and what they can do, there's actually a more than meets the eye to start with. So I think it really does take that kind of commitment to actively making the partnership work. The World Economic Forum Carbon Farming Coalition is super interesting because we kind of pushed to have both public and private sector. So this is a coalition that is trying to figure out how do you operationalize what farmers get paid essentially for changing their farming practices. So if you want more carbon sequestration in European farming, or you want them to change to regenerative ag practices, what does that mean at the farm level? And then how do you back that out into the system of food and fiber and as it moves on from the farm? So we took insurance company, we took a food manufacturer, we took Bayer as an input provider for farmers, we took a farmers association, Planet Labs as a digital provider and imagery provider, and together, so that's part of the system. But then we also took universities to say, look, we need the credibility here. This is not an industry play. We need the credibility to come up together with some solutions that are going to be widely accepted, and the outputs of it are knowledge sharing, kind of farmer focused. So we've got in just a couple of weeks we'll have 5,000 surveys back from the farm level to say, what does this look like? How much does it cost you to do this? What are the incentives that you need to change your behavior? And then we also get from the other members, what does that mean for each of you as we try to stand this up? So it's a very powerful coalition that should really kind of crack some of these big issues that we all need to be connecting about.
I can only imagine the cultural challenges that you must be facing, challenges of competing perspectives when you're dealing with government entities, universities, Silicon Valley startups, and large global companies. Not to mention cultural differences just across geographic lines. It has to be a fascinating experience.
Yeah, and just we also have a commitment. We've talked a bit about Europe and the US, but we have a commitment to reach 100 million smallholder farmers, which is a crazy thing to do, and we're going to do it. It's a really audacious goal. Again, the sense that it is not us as some sort of reputational piece. This is in our core business strategy, to be able to have those go-to-market strategies to reach smallholder farmers. But it takes you can't it takes like an ecosystem of players. You have to connect to the local government to work on the policy side. You have to connect to the bank that's financing the farmer. You have to connect to the buyer who buys stuff from the farmer. So it's the same issue again and again. And I think you get better at doing it over time, but it is a really interesting space to work in.
100 million small farms? Did I hear that correctly?
Yep.
Over what time period have you set that goal?
By 2030.
What else do you see as needed to bridge the gap and make sure that these goals are set out and actually met and that we can measure them.
Yeah, it's the revolution in satellite imaging, of which Planet has been right at the center of, has just had a profound enabling impact on what we need to make these changes in sustainability. It's just tremendous that if we're going to meet these challenges of providing food for our growing population, but living within these planetary boundaries, we have to understand what's happening. We have to have that data, but we can't do it acre by acre, hectare by hectare. It's just not affordable. And so understanding the satellite imaging, but then what's happened is that as well as this revolution in satellite imaging, we've had, when you combine that with drones, sensors, advances in image recognition, AI modeling, hyperspectral advances, you begin to get this like really cool point that we're at. And I have been an advocate for digital ag for years. It's saying, no, really, it's going to change. It's going to disrupt the whole industry, and it hasn't in the ways that I was forecasting years and years ago. But I do feel like we're right on the edge of it. I feel like all of those pieces are coming together to allow us to just be able to have this information at scale and in an affordable way. Now, there's still things we have to solve. Maybe the biggest is the ground truthing question. The imagery is only as good as how you can relate it to what's happening on the ground, and how to do that at scale. We're also coming up with some really great ways forward on that, but that kind of unleashes the power of how you turn the imagery into the actual, business models, into the actual impacts on the ground. And I guess I would just add that technology never works in a vacuum. You also need, of course, all of the policy frameworks. We have a team that's working on digital policy in our public affairs side. There's some really important policies being made right now that could, tip this in one way or the other. In digital ag, so also staying on top of that really critical enabling environment.
Based on your interactions with the farmers and growers, what are other significant barriers to adopting climate-smart agriculture, both at a regional scale and at global scales?
Yeah, I think our work, and we have our Bare Carbon initiative, which is across hundreds of thousands of acres right now in the US and in Brazil are the biggest places. I mentioned Europe. We're also working in Australia, and all of that is carbon sequestration work. So regenerative ag, like cover crops and no-till. In India, we're working on methane reduction, which is another really exciting similar, farm level changes in behavior and changes in farming practices, but focused on methane instead in the rice paddies there. So we've got this whole big machinery that is in the commercial side of the company. It's being driven. We're innovating. We've got lots of partners. We're facing these same challenges that everybody is in this space. How can we agree on a set of science-based measurements that we can report and verify? If you can't do that, you're sort of single company buying, things from their customers, paying their farmers. What we need is that really, clear cracking open of the system, so that we can get a carbon credit system up and running. We also really need to focus this on farmer feedback. So our program is allows us, because we have our digital tools field view, which is one of our main pieces of how we understand the farm level operations. We can focus on what the farmer needs in this. Like we said in the European Carbon Farming Coalition, if you can't get that right, you're just you can't even get out of the starting gate. And then a good example of that is that we've been focused on what we call early adopters. So we're going to pay you as a farmer to change your practices. Sounds great. We'll pay you per acre. We'll watch whether you plant cover crops. But then there's a farmer down the road who's been doing this for 5 years, 10 years already. And we're not going to pay that farmer because they're already doing it. They're not switching. So they're not, increasing their carbon sequestration. So we have to figure out these really, they sound simple, but trying to figure out how you start paying people who are already doing it, how you differentiate the payments for people who are going to start doing it. It ends up being, again, one of those places where you have to work across a lot of different partners to be able to do it. So sticking to that kind of farmer focus, getting it really science-based, and then focusing on the partnerships, I think is really what we're focused on.
Now, that's a really interesting economic problem. How do you drive change while at the same time incentivizing those that have already made it a priority at the outset? It really comes back to that question of when you're trying to craft solutions, how do you take in all the different inputs? How have you been thinking about that? And really making sure you have a diversity of perspectives and lenses as you're crafting these solutions to make change happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've spent 20 years talking to smallholder farmers, so a lot of my work is kind of through the lens of those diverse voices that don't always make it into the into the innovation engines, and it comes out in so many forms. You think about if we were trying to get our next generation tools of gene editing, like how do we make sure that African researchers have access to them, or how do we make sure that our amazing plant breeding innovations that I was just talking about also allow us to innovate in indigenous crops or orphan crops, and those breeding pipelines also begin to accelerate instead of just our big maize and soy commercial. How do you get these digital solutions that for smallholder farmers that have just fundamentally different cropping systems? They don't grow one crop. It's not they don't have clear boundaries to their field. They grow multiple crops. It's a very there's 100 different ways that this question plays out of how do you get those diverse voices embedded into the solutions. And I think that it's a it's a hard question to answer, and I think the organizations that have typically driven towards kind of the underserved have been foundations and development banks and NGOs, and I think in my work, which I worked for and with all of them, they tend to not see that user as a customer. There's sort of a sense of we're going to invent something and you should use it. Whereas in the private sector, there's this idea that like if you're not meeting the needs of your customer, you're gone, right? And so I think one of the keys is to really understand how, in this case, smallholder farmers, they're business people like everybody else. They run multiple businesses out of one household, and kind of treat them as a customer with that respect of understanding, what do we need to do to serve that market? I think is one of the big opening gambits for really getting those that diverse voice into the solutions.
How do you promote behavioral changes both at the local and global scale while maintaining sensitivity to all of those regional differences, or even some of the social customs that you're going to run into? How do you bring that into the equation so that we have solutions that actually can be adopted at broad scale?
Yeah, I think it's part economics for sure. It's a little bit of kind of marketing and customer insights, a little bit of anthropology or sociology, to get the culture part. And but I think if you have this kind of sense that you are innovating for a market, in East Africa or in Vietnam or wherever your smallholder farmers are. Just that focus on the adoption part, just that focus on the household and how they'll use what you're making for them, it is really the answer to it. And it's possible to do that in ways that are not really time intensive. You don't have to have hundreds of boots on the ground to get that information. We're getting much better about bringing those innovation kind of farmer focused loops in. And I think it's funny that I don't know if you know Norman Borlaug, the Nobel Peace Prize winner, but he was has become famous for his aphorism when he said, "Take it to the farmer," which was sort of a like, it's not me. I won the Nobel Prize and I'm one of the giants of history, but don't ask me whether this is valuable. Go ask the farmer, because at the end of the day, those are the pieces that you really need to be able to scale something up.
It sounds like remembering that we're dealing with humans is in the end the most important factor. Sara, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I imagine I could drill you for a lot longer to get more of your insights, but we're at time. Thank you so much for joining us at Planet Explore. We look forward to continuing to partner with Bayer and seeing all of the great work you're doing over the coming years. Thank you again.
My pleasure. It was great to be here.